Tim Paller's taking aim at Chris Minns, saying that he had a dripping sense of entitlement coming out of New South Wales and a Sydney-based mentality. Well, this came after a statement from Tim Pallas as well, and Chris Minns responded at a recent media conference. I'll tell you what he had to say. He was asked about this statement. He said the only thing worse than Victoria taking New South Wales GST dollars was them whinging about it the next day. So it is game on here. I want to bring Kylea Tink, independent MP from North Sydney. Good to see you.
Lovely to see you,
Let's talk GST because, you know, I think it's right. Paul Keating was right. Never get between a premier and a bucket of money. This is one of those cases, right? But it's a Labor federal government and, you know, Labor, wall-to-wall Labor states across the mainland.
You know, I think there's something, every Australian loves a good state-to-state biffo, whether it's NRL or AFL or netball. And I'm a New South Welshman, so I know which side I would come out on in this debate. But I think actually, from a far more serious perspective, what's really important for all of us to remember is that actually the carve-up of the GST is actually done by an independent agency.
Well, kind of.
Kind of.
Right?
The deal that was struck...
But they're only operating in the parameters in which they're given
Correct.
by the Parliament and government of the day. So I'm sorry, Anthony Albanese tried to get away with that yesterday, saying, oh, it's a Commonwealth Grants Commission, we've got nothing to do with the independent body, pretending like he can do nothing about it. That is just simply not true.
I completely agree, and that's where I was going with it. They tell us that it's done by an independent body, but we know that these deals are done behind the back of where they go. We know that the fact WA gets more of the GST at the moment because of a deal that was done with Morrison when he was Treasurer.
Right.
So, and for me, actually, this really brings us back to that question of what does integrity in politics look like? And how do we as Australians know what conversations are being had and why deals are being done? You know, arguably there are questions around the deal with WA actually being something that's about winning seats over there because we know, you know, major parties need to win those seats to stay in power.
Both major parties
100%.
need that to stay in power. So when you talk about integrity in government, I mean, how can you expose that? Because at the moment, they both just say, oh, no, this is a fair deal and this is why, and et cetera, et cetera. But we know how Western Australia is so sensitive to this GST deal as well. Yeah. And they would lose those seats. Labor would lose some of those seats if they axed it.
Yeah,
so,
I think it really is about transparency and accountability and having people involved in the system that are able to call it out when they see it. So, for example, I'm headed back to Canberra next week along with all the other federal parliamentarians, and we have 2 pieces of legislation that are coming before the House next week, which on the surface look like really good pieces of legislation. One of them is all about tax accountability, and in fact that piece of legislation predominantly deals with the issues we saw with PwC. So that is all about making it harder for those consultancies that make money from the government to then use the intelligence they gather to, you know, benefit their clientele. The second piece of legislation is all about improving the occupational health and safety conditions of those people who work on offshore rigs. So those 2 things are really good things, you know, and as a government and as a member for North Sydney, I'd be backing those in. Yet you have to read through to the end of the bill because on the back end of the bill around the PwC reform is the government's proposed changes to the PRRT, which is the Petroleum Rental Resource Tax, which is how we as Australians make money off the resources that companies are taking out of the ground. Now, arguably, what the government reformed there is completely unacceptable. We could be making so much more money out of our resources, but the government's moved it by the slimmest of margins. They've whacked that onto the back of something about accountability. On the second piece of legislation...
So that's one bill?
It's one bill. And the second bill has this, you know, all talk about how we improve occupational health and safety on oil rigs and offshore gas platforms. But on the back of that, there's a provision that would enable the Minerals Minister to go around all of our environmental protections if she wants to approve a new offshore coal or gas project.
Well, that's about a bit of productivity and not getting these gas projects, you know, tied up for years, though.
Well, it is, except it's not related to work sites, you know, and I think that's the coupling, what we see, and what I didn't know this happened. So remembering I'm new into politics, I had no idea that this was the way the process worked in government. And they call them wedge bills.
I guess the point is that the Environment Minister can be voted out if people don't like what she's doing. So it's kind of that representative democracy, Westminster system, that's how it is.
Yeah, 100%, except the provisions, this allows the minister, this is the Minerals Minister, to get around the environmental protection laws. So we're doing a lot of work in Australia at the moment because Australians said they wanted to see our national environmental protection laws strengthened and made better. This new bill would allow those ministers to go around those laws. So it's self-serving. And I guess that's where, you know, I think whenever we get into a situation where we can see that perhaps a reform is actually ultimately benefiting somebody other than the people who live in this country, you've really got to ask questions around, well, why is that happening and is that of the highest integrity?
Okay. It's very subjective, some of this, but I'm glad you raised it. We'll follow it up next week. See you soon.
Thanks, Laura.